The brass key lay on the kitchen counter, its edges worn smooth from decades in my hand. Beside it, a half-empty dog bowl, the water rippling from the panting breaths of the animal now sleeping in my old bed. I stood in the doorway of what was once my sanctuary, the quilt I'd stitched with my own hands now crumpled beneath his paws. My photographs were gone, my dresser emptied. I didn't know a mother's place could be so easily replaced. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. It was late autumn in our quiet Midwestern town, the kind of season where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and the evenings come too quickly. The maple trees along our street had already let go of most of their leaves, scattering them across the yard like faded confetti from some long-forgotten celebration. From my porch I could see the yellowing grass where years ago my son played football with the neighborhood boys, their shouts carrying into the kitchen while I made cocoa. This house was my anchor. I had moved into it with my late husband 46 years ago, back when we were young and the mortgage felt like a mountain we'd never climb. We raised our boy here, in this same home where the floors still creak in the hallway and the bathroom window fogs up just the same way it did in the 70s. After my husband passed, I thought of selling once or twice. The silence in the evenings was heavy, and every creak seemed to echo his absence. But in the end I couldn't leave. Too many pieces of my life were built into the walls, too many memories tucked into corners. And besides, the mortgage was long paid off and the house was mine, the one thing I knew I could keep no matter what storms came. When my son lost his job last year, it was just before Thanksgiving. He called me, his voice tired, saying things at home were tight and he and his wife were looking for a place to stay, just for a little while. I didn't think twice. I told him to bring the children, to bring the dog, to bring whatever made them comfortable. I thought it would be good to have life in the house again. I thought it would feel like family. First it did. The early weeks were warm with noise and togetherness. We shared suppers around the dining table. My roast chicken, his wife's casseroles. The children's laughter drifted through the rooms the way his once did. Even the dog, a big golden retriever with a constantly wagging tail, seemed to bring a bit of joy into the space. I told myself that the little inconveniences were worth it. The extra laundry, the muddy paw prints in the kitchen, the long waits for the bathroom in the mornings. They were family, and family made sacrifices. I remembered my own mother telling me that when the people you love need a place, you make space for them. It wasn't until weeks had passed that I noticed the subtle changes. Small things at first. A shift in tone when I offered to help, a glance exchanged between my son and his wife when I repeated a story I'd already told. The living room, where I had once sat knitting in the evenings, slowly became theirs. My knitting basket was moved to the hall closet, so it wouldn't be in the way. My favorite chair was taken over by the dog. The kitchen, my kitchen, began to feel less like mine. I'd reach for a pot and find it gone, replaced by a shiny set his wife had ordered online. The spice rack I'd kept in the same spot for decades was emptied and restocked with things I didn't recognize. I started waiting until after they went to bed to make my tea, just to avoid feeling like a stranger in my own home. I told myself it was just an adjustment, that living together was bound to have its awkward moments. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself holding onto the edge of my bed and thinking about how quiet things used to be. Quiet in a way that wasn't lonely but peaceful. I loved my son. I still do. That's the part that makes everything so heavy in my chest. I raised him to believe in kindness, to value people over possessions, to remember where he came from. I thought that, at least with me, he would always remember. But slowly, I began to feel like an old piece of furniture no one knew where to put. I was still in the house but not really part of it anymore. The home I had built, the one I had kept standing through decades of work and loss, was changing around me. And I was disappearing inside it. Even the small places where I thought I could keep my space were shrinking. The corner of the yard where I planted my roses became a play area for the dog. The sewing room where I kept my fabric and patterns became a temporary storage area for their boxes. My photographs, the black and whites of my parents, the Polaroids of my son's first birthday, were moved into a cardboard box in the garage. I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss over. It was just for a little while. But a little while had turned into nearly a year, and the parts of the house that still felt like mine were down to the bedroom I slept in and the bathroom I kept stocked with my lavender soap. And even in my bedroom I noticed changes. My quilt, the one I stitched the winter after my husband died, had been borrowed by my granddaughter for a sleepover. My reading lamp had been moved to the living room for better lighting. The space was still mine, but it didn't feel untouched anymore. I told myself I was being sensitive, that perhaps it was just what happens when families live together. But deep down I knew something was shifting, and not in my favor. The house was still mine in name, but I was beginning to understand that in practice, I was no longer the one living at the center of it. I was becoming an afterthought in the very place where I had once been the heart. I didn't know it then, but the day would come when even that last small corner of my home, my own bedroom, would be taken from me. And when it happened, it would change everything. It began with the smallest of shifts, the kind you almost convince yourself you imagined. A coffee cup left unwashed on the counter after I'd already cleaned the kitchen. A sigh when I asked if the children wanted breakfast. A quiet, almost imperceptible tightening in my daughter-in-law's voice when I mentioned how I used to run the household. The warmth of those early months seemed to thin like the last light before dusk. My place at the dining table was moved to the end, so the kids could have more room. They said it kindly with smiles, but when we sat down to eat, conversation flowed around me instead of toward me. I would pass the potatoes, offer the rolls, and no one would notice if I said nothing at all. One Sunday afternoon, I came back from a short walk to find the television blaring and the living room rearranged. My knitting basket was gone. My books, which had rested on the coffee table for years, were stacked in the hall closet. "We thought it'd look less cluttered," my son said when I asked. His wife nodded, eyes on the screen. I started retreating to my bedroom earlier in the evenings. Not because I wanted to be alone, but because sitting in a room where I felt invisible was lonelier than being by myself. I would close the door, turn on my reading lamp, and try to lose myself in a book, but even that small refuge began to feel fragile. The dog, large and restless, took to wandering into my room. I didn't mind at first. But one night, I came in to find muddy paw prints on my quilt and my pillow damp from his nose. When I mentioned it, my daughter-in-law laughed lightly, saying, "Oh, he just loves your room. It's warmer in there." I smiled faintly, but something inside me tightened. Conversations between my son and his wife began to take on a hushed tone when I entered the kitchen. I'd hear fragments: space, too crowded, better for everyone. And then silence, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck. I tried to be useful, thinking perhaps if I eased their load, the edges between us might soften again. I folded their laundry when I saw it in the dryer. I baked pies for no reason. I offered to babysit whenever they needed. Sometimes they accepted. More often they would say, "Oh, that's okay, we've got it." The dog grew bolder in his claim to the house. His bed, a large plush cushion, appeared in the corner of the living room where my rocking chair used to be. Then another cushion in the hallway. And finally, one afternoon, I came into the kitchen and saw a small cabinet cleared for his treats and supplies, right where I used to keep my baking pans. My son still called me Mom, but the word felt thinner now, like paper worn soft at the edges. The laughter we once shared seemed replaced with quick, practical exchanges. "Could you pick up milk? The dog needs walking. We're having friends over, so maybe you could stay in your room tonight?" They never said it outright, but the message was clear enough. The grandchildren still hugged me, still asked for stories sometimes, but even they began to knock less often on my bedroom door. The house was alive with voices and footsteps, yet I felt like a shadow moving quietly through it. One evening in early winter, I was making tea when my daughter-in-law came in with the dog, wiping his paws. She glanced toward the hallway. "You know," she said casually, "he's been scratching at your door a lot lately. He really likes that space. It might be easier if we just set him up in there." She laughed as though it were a harmless idea. I forced a smile, my hands tightening around the teacup. After she left the room, I stood by the kettle, the steam rising in soft clouds, and I felt the first sharp sting of something I couldn't name yet. Not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet warning in my bones. The small humiliations began to stack like stones. My coat moved to a hook in the garage because the entryway was too cluttered. My dishes replaced by a matching set they had brought in. The scent of my lavender soap replaced by their citrus bottles in the bathroom. None of these things by themselves seemed worth a fight. But together they built a truth I could no longer ignore. I was a guest in the house I had built. And guests, I was learning, could be moved out whenever it suited the hosts. I didn't know the exact day or hour it would happen, but the feeling in my chest told me it was coming. My place here was shrinking one quiet inch at a time. Soon there would be no room left at all. It was a Tuesday evening in early February, the kind of cold that makes the windows shiver and the air inside feel heavy. I had gone to the church down the street for Bible study. Just a small circle of women, some older, some younger, all of us glad for a reason to get out of the house in winter. We talked about patience, about endurance, about how sometimes love means stepping back. I remember holding those words in my mind as I walked home, the crunch of snow beneath my boots sounding steady, almost comforting. When I opened the front door, the house was unusually quiet. The television wasn't on, the children weren't running down the hallway. The only sound was the deep rhythmic breathing of the dog. It was coming from my bedroom. I stepped into the hallway, and at first I didn't recognize the room at the end. My door was wide open. The quilt I'd stitched in the winter after my husband passed, deep burgundy squares, with soft cream edges, was crumpled at the foot of the bed. The pillows were thrown haphazardly near the dresser. And there, stretched out across the mattress, the dog lay sleeping as though he'd claimed it his whole life. My dresser drawers were empty. The framed photograph of my parents, the one that always sat on my nightstand, was gone. The small basket where I kept my Bible and reading glasses had vanished. In their place stood a shiny water bowl and a scattering of dog toys. I stood in the doorway, my gloved hand still clutching the church bulletin, the cold from outside clinging to my skin. From the kitchen, I heard my son's voice, casual, as though nothing about this scene was unusual. "Mom, we moved your things into the storage room at the back. It's warmer for the dog in here, and he's been restless at night. We thought it would be better this way." Better. The word sat heavy in my chest. I walked slowly toward the small room at the end of the hall, a space that had once been a pantry decades ago, before my husband converted it into a storage area. There was a narrow bed shoved against the wall, a single blanket folded neatly on top. My boxes of sewing supplies were stacked against the window, blocking the little light that could have come in. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, the faint dampness of a room that had been closed off for too long. My clothes were hung neatly in a row, but the rest of my belongings, the photographs, the quilt, the little keepsakes from years gone by, were stacked in cardboard boxes. It was the kind of room you might give to someone visiting for a night or two, not the woman who had spent decades turning this house into a home. I didn't speak. I didn't ask why. I didn't remind him whose name was still written on the deed. Instead, I walked back to my old room, or what used to be my old room, and stood quietly, looking at the dog curled up in the center of my bed. His tail thumped once against the quilt. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not a snap, not a loud break, but a slow, deliberate turning, like a door closing from the inside. I realized, with a clarity I could feel in my bones, that they didn't see me as the heart of this home anymore. I was a piece of furniture they decided to move, something to be shifted to make space for what they valued more. I thought about the nights I'd stayed awake worrying about my son when he was young and sick with fever, the years of saving so he could have a proper education, the meals cooked, the laundry folded, the life built around giving him more than I ever had. And now here I was, standing at the edge of a bed I no longer belonged to, watching the dog stretch his paws over the place where my head used to rest. I felt no anger in that moment, only an immense stillness. It was as though my heart had stepped back, just enough to see the truth without flinching. That night, I lay in the narrow bed in the storage room, the cold seeping through the walls, the sound of the dog patting down the hallway as if to remind me that my place had changed. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster with my eyes. And somewhere in that stillness I made a quiet decision. I would not ask for my room back. I would not argue, plead, or demand to be seen. But I would not let them decide the end of my story in this house. For now I would move softly. I would keep my voice calm and my hands steady. I would smile when I needed to. But beneath it all, I would begin preparing for the day when this space, every inch of it, would be mine to decide about again. I closed my eyes that night, not with the comfort of home, but with the steady, quiet knowledge that something had been broken, and something else was beginning to grow in its place. The next morning, the frost on the window panes shimmered in the early light, thin as lace. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the storage room, wrapping my quilt around my shoulders. The air in here carried that still, unused scent, a mix of dust and something faintly metallic. I could hear the muffled thump of the dog bounding across the hall, my old room, and my son's low voice calling to him. I didn't go to the kitchen right away. Instead, I reached for the small wooden box I had kept hidden at the back of my closet for years. Inside were my most important papers. Social Security notices, Medicare letters, the original deed to the house, and a stack of bank statements neatly clipped together. I'd almost forgotten the feel of that deed in my hands, the weight of it, the crisp paper worn soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded over the years. My husband's name and mine side by side. I set the papers on my lap, smoothing each one with careful hands. These were not just documents. They were proof that I had built a life here, that every nail in the walls and every shingle on the roof had been part of my work, my care. And yet, somewhere along the way, my presence had become negotiable. As I looked over the papers, a thought took root. Not wild or vengeful but steady. I would not be pushed out of my own home. But I would not fight them for it either. I would choose my own path and I would walk it quietly. After breakfast, I went about the day as if nothing had changed. I helped the children with their coats before school, washed a few dishes, folded laundry. On the surface, everything was the same. But in my mind, the ground had shifted. I had moved from reacting to preparing. In the afternoons, when the house was empty, I began sorting my belongings in secret. Not the way you pack for a trip, but the way you prepare for a departure you know will matter. I went through each box in the storage room, deciding what I would take, what I would give away, and what could be left behind without regret. Some things were easy, the chipped teapot, the worn-out shoes. Others made me pause. My husband's flannel shirts, still faintly smelling of cedar from the closet. The small porcelain bird my mother had given me when I was 17. I wrapped them carefully in old scarves and tucked them into a larger box, I labeled only with my initials. In the evenings when the family gathered in the living room, I would sit quietly in the corner, knitting or pretending to read, listening more than speaking. Their conversations had little to do with me now, and I no longer expected otherwise. But I paid attention. I noticed which friends they spoke to, which plans they made. I noted how easily my absence from their circle had become normal. It hurt, yes, but it also freed me. There is a certain strength in seeing the truth without flinching. One Thursday, I walked to the library after lunch. I told them I was returning books, but I stayed longer than usual, sitting at a corner table with a stack of brochures from the community board. Senior housing resources, legal aid for the elderly, housing rights for homeowners. I tucked the most relevant pamphlets into my handbag, feeling the quiet thrill of taking a step forward that no one else knew about. That night, I read them under the lamplight in my small room, my tea cooling beside me. The words were plain, the advice direct. As long as my name was on the deed, my decisions about the house were final. I didn't need permission to decide what would happen to it. That sentence stayed with me, turning over in my mind like a smooth stone in my pocket. From then on, my days had two layers. On the surface, I moved gently through the rhythms of the house, making soup, mending clothes, tending the rose bushes even in the frost. But beneath that, I was laying the quiet groundwork for something larger. I made a small list of phone numbers in the back of my address book. I copied important papers and slipped the originals into the pages of an old cookbook no one touched. I began carrying my handbag from room to room, never leaving it behind. It wasn't a plan born of haste or fury. It was a slow, careful gathering of strength, the kind that doesn't look like much until the moment it's needed. I stopped trying to reclaim my old room. I let the dog have it without complaint. I slept in the storage room as if it had always been mine, and in doing so, I stopped giving them the satisfaction of seeing my hurt. My quiet was not defeat. It was a space where my resolve could grow without interference. In the stillness of those nights, I thought often of my younger self, the girl who once stood on a train platform with a suitcase, leaving her childhood home because there was no place for her there anymore. I remembered the sting of that loss, the way it had hardened certain corners of my heart. Back then I had no choice. This time I did. I began to feel something I hadn't in months. Not joy exactly, but a small, steady warmth. The warmth of knowing that I was not powerless, that even in the quiet, I was shaping the future in my own way. And though they didn't see it, every day I was taking back a little more of what they thought they had claimed. Not the room, not the chair in the living room, not even the kitchen. Something more important, the right to decide where I belonged, and how my story in this house would end. I didn't know exactly when the moment would come, but I knew now that when it did, I would be ready. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. The first real step came on a Wednesday morning when the house was still and quiet. The children had gone to school, my son to work, and his wife was out running errands. The dog was asleep in the sunbeam on what used to be my bed. I wrapped my scarf around my neck, tucked my handbag close to my side, and walked down the block to the bus stop. The bus ride to the library took only 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing a small border. The moment I stepped inside, I was in a place where my decisions mattered again. No one here looked at me as though I was in the way. I walked straight to the community board and scanned the notices until I found the one I'd been thinking about for days. Free legal help for seniors, Thursdays from 1 to 4 p.m. I wrote down the phone number in my address book, but I didn't go home right away. Instead, I wandered through the aisles, letting my fingers run along the spines of the books. I picked up one on gardening, another on memoir writing, and a slim pamphlet about senior property rights in our state. The pamphlet was thin, but the words inside were solid as brick. It spelled out in simple language what I had already suspected. As the sole name on the deed, I had full authority over my home. My home. The words settled into me like a warm stone. The next day I called the number. A woman with a calm voice answered, introducing herself as Linda from the Housing Rights Group. I told her without too much detail that I was the legal owner of my home but felt my place in it was slipping away. I half expected her to sound hurried or distracted, but instead she asked me to take my time. She really listened, and when I was done she said, "You have more control than you think. And you don't have to do this alone." Her words stayed with me all day. We arranged to meet at their office the following Tuesday. I didn't tell anyone. That morning I dressed simply, the way I always did, and told my son I was going to the library. At the office, Linda sat with me at a table scattered with papers and pens. She explained what my options were, laid them out slowly and clearly. There was no rush, no judgment, just the facts and the reassurance that the law was on my side. I left with a folder of documents tucked deep in my handbag, along with a small card bearing her direct number. From then on, I began keeping certain things in an old tin cookie box that I hid in the back of the sewing cabinet. The folder from Linda went in first, along with the copies of my deed and my will. I began adding small things, receipts, handwritten notes to myself, addresses of people I might need to call. It wasn't a secret born of deceit, but of protection. At home I moved carefully. I spoke kindly, kept to my tasks, and never hinted at what I was doing. The dog had the run of the house now, and I had the run of my thoughts. Some days I went to the post office under the pretense of mailing letters, but instead I visited the courthouse to confirm certain property records. The clerk there, a man with soft gray hair and tired eyes, printed a certified copy of my deed for a small fee. I slipped it into my handbag, feeling its weight against my side all the way home. It was a strange sort of power, this quiet preparation. I didn't strut with it, didn't even smile more than usual. But inside I could feel something straightening in me. The part that had bent these past months, now slowly rising again. I started keeping a small notebook in my pocket, jotting down ideas, names, timelines. I never wrote anything that would reveal my entire plan, just enough to keep my steps in order. At the same time, I noticed how the family's regard for me had grown even thinner. One evening they had friends over, and I stayed in my room the entire time, knitting in the lamplight. No one came to check on me, and I realized they were growing accustomed to my absence. That suited me fine. The less they saw of my movements, the more room I had to work in peace. It became almost like two parallel lives, the one they saw where I was quiet and compliant, and the one they couldn't see, where every day brought another small act of reclaiming what was mine. I didn't tell the children anything, though sometimes my granddaughter would peek into my room to sit for a few minutes. She'd look around at the boxes stacked neatly in the corner, and ask why I kept everything so organized. I'd just smile and tell her it was easier that way. Each evening before I turned out the light, I'd open the cookie tin and look at the papers inside. It was my private ritual. A reminder that no matter how small my space had become in this house, the truth was still mine to hold. One afternoon Linda called to check in. She asked how I was feeling, and I told her honestly, calmer. Not because my circumstances had changed yet, but because I was no longer standing still. She said something then that I wrote down immediately in my notebook. Calm doesn't mean doing nothing. It means knowing where you're going. I closed the notebook, tucked it into my handbag, and felt the faintest flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not joy, not relief, but readiness. The reckoning had begun, and no one in this house knew it but me. Some nights in the small storage room, I would lie awake with the sound of the dog shifting in my old bedroom, and memories would come uninvited. Memories I had kept folded away for decades, like letters I couldn't bear to burn. It was late summer of 1966, the year my father remarried. My mother had been gone for 2 years by then, a sudden illness taking her before I had learned how to braid my hair properly. Our house was smaller than the one I live in now, but to me it was the whole world. A narrow porch, a kitchen that smelled of coffee in the mornings, and a bedroom where I kept my collection of pressed flowers in a cigar box under the bed. When my father brought his new wife home, she smiled at me in a polite way, like you might greet a neighbor's child. At first, I tried to believe her warmth would come in time. But soon small changes began to happen. My mother's dishes disappeared from the cupboards, replaced by shiny new ones. My father's old armchair was moved to the shed. And my bedroom, my quiet little room with the lace curtains my mother had sewn, was emptied out one afternoon without warning. They told me it was just more practical for me to share a bed with her 2 daughters. My room became a sewing room for her. I remember standing in the doorway, staring at the space where my bed had been, the wallpaper still marked with the faint shadow where my dresser had stood. That night, I lay in a bed that wasn't mine, next to girls who spoke to each other in whispers I couldn't quite hear. The air smelled different, like someone else's perfume. It was then I learned what it feels like to be gently, politely pushed out of a place that once felt safe. No one shouted, no one told me I didn't belong, but every choice, every rearrangement spoke it clearly enough. By the following spring, I was sent to live with my aunt 2 towns over. They said it would be easier with the new family arrangements. I left with a single suitcase and the pressed flowers in my cigar box. I remember standing on the train platform, holding that suitcase, feeling the summer heat press against my back, and thinking, I have nowhere to go back to. My aunt was kind in her way, but it was not the same. I learned to keep my belongings small, easy to carry. I learned to listen before speaking, to read a room before I stepped into it. And I learned, perhaps most of all, that once someone decides you are no longer part of their center, you cannot make them see you differently. Those years hardened something inside me, not in a bitter way but in a way that kept me cautious. When I married, I held tight to the idea of a home that no one could take from me. My husband and I worked through lean years to buy our own house. Every bill we paid, every repair we managed, was another stone in the wall of safety I thought I had built around myself. For nearly 50 years, I believed I had outrun that feeling from my childhood, the feeling of standing at a threshold and realizing the room on the other side no longer belonged to me. But lying there now, in a storage room inside the house I had built, I felt the echo of that moment as clearly as if it had just happened. It was the same quiet eviction, dressed in different years and faces. My father's polite voice had been replaced by my son's practical tone. The lace curtains had been replaced by my quilt, now crumpled beneath the dog's paws. The suitcase I carried then had become the boxes stacked neatly by my new bed. I realized something, staring at the ceiling that night. This was not the first time I had been displaced, but it would be the last time I accepted it without deciding the terms myself. That girl on the train platform had no say in where she was going. But this woman, this 74-year-old widow with the deed in her name and the weight of decades behind her, she did have a say. The wound of that long-ago summer had never fully closed, but now I saw it differently. It was not just a scar. It was a map. It had taught me where the edges were, how far someone might go if you let them, and when it was time to step forward on your own path, no matter how narrow it seemed at first. I thought about my mother's lace curtains, the way the afternoon light used to filter through them, soft and golden. I thought about the way I used to press flowers flat between pages, knowing they would change shape and color but still hold some part of their beauty. You cannot stop change, I knew that. But you can choose what remains, what you carry with you, and what you let fall away. And so in that dim little storage room, I began to see my present not as a defeat, but as a moment in the middle of a longer story. The girl who once had nowhere to go now had a place, and more importantly, she had the power to decide who stayed in it and who did not. It would take time. It would take quiet steps, careful ones. But I would not be sent away again without my own hand on the door. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray and still, the kind of day when even the air seems to wait for something. I was dusting the bookshelf in the hallway, the one just outside the living room, when I heard voices. My son's tone was low, the way it gets when he doesn't want me to hear. His wife's voice followed, sharper at the edges. I froze, my hand still resting on the spine of an old gardening book. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I told myself I would move in a moment. But then I caught the words that pinned me in place. If we can just get the deed changed over, it'll be easier to manage. She's not using the space like she used to anyway. My heart thudded once, heavy and slow. She won't fight it, his wife said. She doesn't like confrontation. We'll just tell her it's for the best, and then, well, the assisted living place has that open room. She'd be better off there. Better off. The same phrase I'd heard decades ago when they sent me to live with my aunt. I stood there, staring at the shelf without seeing it. My son, my only child, was making plans to take the home I had built, the home I had kept through years of loss and work, and place me somewhere else. Somewhere they could visit when it suited them. Somewhere out of the way. I took a slow breath, willing my hand to stay steady on the duster. I heard them moving around in the living room, their voices dropping lower, the words too muffled to make out now. But I didn't need to hear more. The truth was already clear. I went into the kitchen and began rinsing a teacup, my hands moving without thought. The window over the sink looked out onto the backyard. Bare now, the rose bushes skeletal in the winter cold. I used to stand here and watch my son play in the grass, his laughter carrying through the open window. I thought then that no matter what else life took from me, he would always be my home as much as I was his. Now I saw how wrong I had been. After they left for the grocery store, I stepped into my old bedroom. The dog was there, sprawled across the quilt. His eyes opened briefly, then closed again. I sat on the edge of the bed, not because I wanted to be there, but because I needed to look at this space and understand that it was no longer mine in any way that mattered to them. My gaze drifted to the corner where my nightstand used to be. I remembered setting my teacup there in the evenings, the lamp casting a pool of warm light as I read. That lamp was now in the living room. My books were packed in boxes in the garage. The room held no trace of me except the quilt, and even that was just another layer beneath the dog's comfort. The quiet in the house felt heavier than any noise could have been. It pressed against me as I walked back to the storage room and closed the door behind me. I sat on the narrow bed, folded my hands in my lap, and let the truth settle in its full weight. They were not waiting for me to leave on my own. They were making plans to push me out. And in that moment, the slow ache I had been carrying turned into something colder, sharper. Not rage, that would have burned out too quickly. This was something steadier. A knowledge that whatever time I had left in this house would be on my terms, not theirs. I pulled the cookie tin from the back of the sewing cabinet and opened it. The deed, the legal advice from Linda, the certified copies, all there, all in order. My hands smoothed over the papers the way you might smooth over a child's hair. I thought of the years I had worked for this home, of the promises I had kept to myself after being sent away at 17. And I thought, too, of the single mother I'd met briefly at the library one afternoon, her voice trembling as she told a volunteer she had nowhere safe to take her children. The idea had been small then, just a thought in the back of my mind. But now it grew, took shape. I could give this house away, not to them but to someone who truly needed it. Someone who would see it as a gift, not as an inheritance to be claimed early. It would not be revenge. It would be reclamation. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay awake listening to the house breathe around me. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the pipes sighing in the walls, the creak of the floorboards as the dog padded down the hall. I thought about every corner of this place, every memory embedded in it. And I thought about the day I would hand the keys to someone who saw its worth not in dollars, but in shelter, safety, and love. By morning, the decision was no longer just an idea. It was a promise I made to myself. They believed they had time. They believed I would go quietly into whatever plan they had decided for me. and I would go quietly, but not where they thought. After that day, something in me settled into a stillness they could not read. I no longer tried to be part of their evenings in the living room, no longer offered to make dinner or start conversations at the table. I moved through the house like a shadow, soft-footed and silent, leaving no trace for them to find except the daily tasks I still tended to. The laundry folded, the dishes washed, the plants watered. But my quiet was not the quiet of defeat. It was the quiet of someone who has already chosen her path and is walking it without looking back. I began spending more time at the library, sometimes returning with a tote bag of books I didn't even plan to read. Inside, hidden beneath the covers of cookbooks or gardening manuals, were the papers I needed for my preparations. When I got home, I would slip them into the cookie tin in my sewing cabinet before anyone noticed. The storage room became my base. I kept it neat, almost bare, as though I might leave at a moment's notice. My most important belongings, the quilt, a few photographs, my Bible, and the cookie tin were all within arm's reach. I didn't want to scramble when the time came. I stopped trying to reclaim spaces that were no longer mine. The rocking chair in the living room, the spot at the dining table, the quilt on my old bed. All of it I let go without a word. In their eyes it must have looked like surrender. In truth it was the opposite. The less I clung to the small battles, the more strength I saved for the one that mattered. I started keeping my handbag with me everywhere. Even in the house, it stayed by my side or within sight. Inside were copies of the deed, the card from Linda, a small notebook of dates and phone numbers, and a pen I trusted. Nothing in that bag was there by accident. When they asked where I went on my afternoons out, I would smile and say I was walking in the park or browsing at the thrift store. In truth, I was meeting with people from the housing rights group, visiting the courthouse for paperwork, and quietly speaking with the woman I had met at the library, the one who needed a home. Her name was Marlene. She had 2 young children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 9. They were living in a small motel room after losing their rental, paying week to week and barely keeping up. I didn't tell her everything at first, only that I might be able to help her find something more stable. She looked at me with that mixture of hope and disbelief I understood too well. At home I avoided any discussion about the future. If my son mentioned the house, I would nod politely and change the subject. If his wife hinted again about assisted living, I would smile faintly and say, "We'll see." I gave them no reason to press the issue, no hint of resistance, no sign of a plan. Inside, I was moving pieces into place. I spoke with Linda again, this time about the logistics of transferring ownership. We went over the details carefully, how it could be done legally, how to ensure it could not be reversed without my consent, how to protect myself even after the transfer. Each step felt deliberate, solid. In the evenings, when the house was full of voices and footsteps, I stayed in my room, the door closed, the lamp casting its soft pool of light on the bed. I wrote out a timeline in my notebook, not in a rush, but with the patience of someone sewing a strong seam. The day I would sign the papers. The day Marlene would bring her children. The day I would hand over the key. I didn't imagine their reaction. I didn't picture the conversation that would follow. That part didn't matter to me anymore. What mattered was that I would decide, and they would have no power to undo it. It's a strange thing how silence can become a shield. The less I spoke, the more invisible I became to them, and the more room I had to act without notice. They began making plans and arrangements as though I had already faded into the background entirely, and I let them believe that. The winter deepened, snow falling in soft layers over the yard. I would watch it from the small window in my room, the frost edging the glass like lace. I thought often of my mother's curtains from my childhood home, how they had caught the light, and I thought of how much stronger I was now than the girl who had once been sent away without a choice. This time, I was not waiting for someone to decide my fate. I was deciding it for myself. When I moved through the house now, I felt less like a guest and more like a quiet owner surveying her ground one last time. I touched the walls in the hallway, the banister on the stairs, the kitchen counter worn smooth in places from years of cooking. Soon these would belong to someone else, someone who would treasure them the way I once did. It was not loss I felt anymore. It was readiness. And in that readiness I found a kind of peace. Marlene and I met again on a Tuesday morning, in the corner of the library where the sun reached in through the tall windows and fell in warm patches on the carpet. She had her children with her this time, the boy Dylan carrying a worn backpack and the girl Sophie, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear bent. They were quiet at first, sitting close to their mother, eyes darting around the room as though expecting to be told to move along. I asked if they wanted to look at the children's section, and slowly, they wandered toward the low shelves, their small hands brushing over bright covers. Marlene sat across from me, her shoulders tight, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee as though it were the only thing keeping them warm. "They're good kids," she said, her voice low. They need somewhere to land. I can't keep them in that motel much longer." I nodded, letting her speak. I didn't tell her yet what I had decided, not fully. Instead, I asked about the kind of place she imagined for them, a yard, a safe neighborhood, a school they could walk to. As she spoke, I pictured my own yard, the worn wooden fence, the way the maple tree in the front shed leaves in golden drifts each fall. We met like that every week for the next month. Sometimes at the library, sometimes in the little diner 2 blocks over, where the waitress always refilled our coffee without asking. The children began to greet me with small smiles, and once Sophie slipped the stuffed rabbit onto my side of the booth for safekeeping while she went to the restroom. At home, no one asked where I'd been. My absence had become part of the routine now, another piece of the background they no longer noticed. That suited me fine. Linda called one afternoon to say she had everything ready. All it would take was my signature, and the date we set for the transfer. Her voice was steady, practical, but I could hear the trace of warmth there too, as though she understood the quiet satisfaction I felt. I sat in my small room that evening, the cookie tin open on the bed, looking at the papers inside. The deed, the certified copies, the transfer forms Linda had prepared. I thought about my son, about the life we had once shared in this house, the years of care and sacrifice. And I thought about Marlene's children, how their eyes might light up at a room of their own, a yard to run in. It was then I knew with certainty, I wasn't just giving the house away to keep it from being taken. I was giving it to someone who would love it the way I once did, someone who would see its worth beyond its walls. One afternoon, I invited Marlene to walk by the house with me. We stayed on the sidewalk talking about the maple tree in the yard, the way the sun hit the porch in the late afternoon. She didn't ask why I brought her there, and I didn't explain. Not yet. But I saw her eyes linger on the windows, and I could almost feel the hope rising in her. The first real snowstorm of the year came that week. The children in the house, my grandchildren, spent the afternoon building a snowman in the yard, their laughter carrying through the cold air. I watched from the window of my small room, and for the first time in a long while, I felt no ache to join them. My place in this story had shifted, and I accepted that. My focus was on something larger now. In the quiet of the evenings, I began to write letters. One to my lawyer, confirming my wishes. One to Marlene, explaining the gift and the terms, that she could live here as long as she wished, that she could make it her own. And one to my son, though I didn't yet decide if I would leave it behind or hand it to him myself. Each letter was written slowly in careful script, the kind my mother had taught me when I was a girl. There was no anger in the words, only clarity. By the time the new year came, everything was in place. Linda had the papers ready. Marlene knew there was a possibility, though not the certainty, of a home. And I had found a strange, steady peace in knowing that what was mine to give would be given freely, not taken. That peace became my strength. The next time my son's wife hinted about the benefits of assisted living, I simply smiled and said, "I'm taking care of my own arrangements." She nodded, satisfied, not realizing how true that was. Marlene and I set a date to meet again, and this time I would tell her everything. I imagined her children running up the front steps, Sophie's rabbit tucked under her arm, Dylan already asking if they could plant flowers in the spring. The image warmed me more than any memory I still held of this house in its early years. I had not only found the power to decide, I had found a reason to use it that went beyond myself. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. The days after I told Marlene were unlike any others that winter. There was no grand announcement, no fanfare. Just a quiet moment at our usual corner table in the diner, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes fixed on mine as I said the words. "I'm giving you the house." For a long moment she didn't speak. Her hand tightened on the edge of the table, and I could see her trying to understand if I meant what I had just said. When the truth sank in, tears filled her eyes. She shook her head, whispering, No one's ever done something like this for me. It's not just for you, I said gently. It's for them too. I glanced toward Dylan and Sophie, who were bent over their hot chocolate, oblivious to the change about to enter their lives. From that day, the papers moved quickly. Linda arranged a meeting at her office, where the deed transfer would be signed and notarized. I kept the appointment to myself, blending it into my usual library visits and errands. At home, my son and his wife noticed little things, the way I kept my handbag closer than before, the way I no longer asked for help with groceries. My son once asked why I'd been so busy lately, but I only smiled and said I was catching up on reading. Still, there was a subtle shift in his tone. He began checking in on me more than he had in months, not out of concern I suspected, but out of a growing unease he couldn't quite name. I saw it in the way his eyes lingered on me when I walked through the living room, the way he paused before answering my questions. One evening I overheard him telling his wife, "I think she's planning something. She's quieter, but it's different." Her response was a dismissive laugh followed by, "She wouldn't know where to start." If only she knew. When the day came to sign the transfer, the sky was heavy with snow clouds. I wore my warmest coat, tucked the necessary papers into my bag, and walked to the bus stop with the same unhurried steps I had taken every week. At Linda's office, the papers were laid out in neat stacks. I read each line carefully, my glasses sliding slightly down my nose, and then signed my name with a steady hand. The moment my pen lifted from the page, I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't triumph, it was release. Marlene signed next, her hand trembling. She thanked me quietly, her voice breaking, and I told her the only truth I knew. Take care of it. Fill it with life. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked the same. The dog barked from my old room, my son's voice carried from the kitchen, and the children's laughter rang from upstairs. But I walked through the front door knowing that everything had changed, even if they didn't yet realize it. Over the next few days, small ripples began to show. I noticed my son watching me more closely, as though he could sense the ground shifting under his feet. Once, I caught him glancing at the stack of mail I'd brought in, his eyes flicking over the envelopes before I set them in my room. I moved with the same steady rhythm as before, but inside I was no longer holding my breath. The decision was made, the papers filed, the future sealed. It wasn't long before Linda called to confirm that the transfer had been recorded. The house was no longer mine, and yet, in the truest sense, it still was. I had chosen where it would go. I had kept it safe from the hands that would have taken it without care. The next step would be telling them. I knew there was no way to soften it, but I also knew I would not be cruel. The truth would be delivered the same way every other decision in this process had been, calmly, clearly, and without apology. Until that day came, I kept my usual place in the house. I still folded laundry when it needed doing. I still tended the rose bushes outside, their branches bare in the cold. But each time I touched the house, the door frame, the banister, the worn wood of the kitchen counter, I did so knowing it was already in the hands of someone who would love it as deeply as I had. The strange thing was, I no longer felt the sting of what my son had done. The betrayal was still real, still sharp in memory, but it no longer ruled my days. In its place was a sense of quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from keeping a promise to yourself. They had wanted to decide my ending here. Instead, I had written it myself. It was a Sunday afternoon in late February, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and pale, and the air feels like it's holding back snow. The house was quiet except for the hum of the heater, and the muffled sound of the dog shifting on my old bed. My son and his wife were in the kitchen talking over coffee. I stood for a moment in the hallway, my hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the wood worn smooth under my fingers. I had touched that same spot thousands of times over the decades, when I carried my son as a baby, when I came in from tending the roses, when I walked past on my way to bed. This time I touched it knowing it would be one of the last. I stepped into the kitchen. They both looked up, surprised to see me there in the middle of the afternoon. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice even. They waited, their expressions curious, a little wary. "I've made arrangements for the house," I continued. "It's no longer mine." The silence that followed was sharp. My son's brow furrowed, his wife's mouth opening slightly before she closed it again. "What do you mean, not yours?" my son asked finally. "I signed it over," I said. To someone who needs it. She has 2 children. They'll be moving in soon. He blinked as though he hadn't heard me right. His wife's face flushed, her hand tightening on the coffee mug. You gave it away, she said, her voice higher now. Yes, I replied, still calm. The papers are filed. It's done. They stared at me, searching for some sign that I was joking or confused, or could be convinced to undo it. I gave them none. You could have. My son began, but I lifted my hand gently, stopping him. This house was mine to give, I said. It was never yours to take. I've chosen where it will go, and that choice is final. His mouth closed, but his eyes were wide, unsteady. I could see the questions in them, the protests forming, but none of them made it past his lips. His wife leaned forward slightly. Why would you do this? We could have. You could have what? I asked softly. Moved me out so you could keep it? Decided my place without asking me? I've lived through that before. Once in my life was enough. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My words were steady, measured, as certain as the ground beneath my feet. You'll have time to make your own arrangements, I said. I'll be moving into the back room as a tenant. The new owner has agreed to it. I'll be paying my own way, and I'll be living by my own terms. My son's face shifted then, not anger, not yet, but something else. A kind of startled realization. The slow dawning that the story he had been writing in his mind had just been replaced with one he couldn't control. You've planned this, he said finally. Yes, I answered. Quietly. Carefully. Without anyone's permission but my own. For a moment no one moved. The dog barked once from the other room, the sound breaking the stillness, and then quiet fell again. I stepped back toward the hallway, my hand brushing the edge of the doorframe one more time. Dinner will be ready at 6, I said, my voice as even as if nothing at all had changed. And then I left them there, sitting in the kitchen with the knowledge of what I had done, and the weight of their own silence. In my room I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't feel triumphant and I didn't feel regret. I felt something deeper, the steady, grounded peace of having chosen for myself. It wasn't a battle won. It was a life reclaimed. The move happened on a clear, cold morning in early March. Snow still clung in thin patches along the edges of the yard, but the air had that sharp brightness that hinted at spring. I stood at the front window of my small room and watched as a modest moving truck pulled up to the curb. Marlene stepped out first, followed by Dylan and Sophie, their faces alive with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. They carried boxes into the house slowly, almost reverently, as though each step needed to be remembered. Marlene's eyes met mine when she came down the hallway the first time, and I saw it there, the gratitude, the weight of what this moment meant for her. She didn't speak, just gave a small wordless nod. The kind of gesture that says more than any thank you ever could. My son and his wife were not there. They had left early that morning, saying little to me the night before. I didn't ask where they went. Some distances don't need to be measured in words. As the day went on, the house began to change. Marlene's children's laughter echoed through the rooms, chasing away a stillness that had settled here for too long. Sophie found the small nook under the stairs where I used to store winter blankets and declared it her reading corner. Dylan ran his hands along the banister, as though testing its strength, and asked if they could hang his drawings on the kitchen wall. I told them yes, of course. By evening, the scent of something new, tomato soup simmering on the stove, bread warming in the oven, drifted through the air. It mingled with the faint scent of the rose soap I had placed in the bathroom that morning, a small gift for them to find. My back room, now truly mine, was simple but warm. I had my quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, my Bible on the nightstand, and the potted plant I'd brought in from the porch resting by the window. The rest of my belongings fit into a single trunk at the end of the bed. For the first time in months, I felt the space around me was truly mine to arrange, to keep. In the days that followed, I learned the new rhythms of the house. Marlene worked mornings, and I would sometimes watch the children until they returned from school. In the afternoons we would sit together at the kitchen table, drinking tea and talking about small things, recipes, the weather, the best way to keep the roses healthy come spring. It wasn't my house anymore, but in a way it still felt like home, not because of ownership but because it was alive again. The house had a heartbeat and it was steady. One evening I stood at the window, watching as Dylan and Sophie built a small snow fort in the yard. The air was filled with their laughter, and I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. This was the right choice, not just for me but for the house, for the life it still had to give. There were moments, of course, when the old ache stirred. Passing my former bedroom, I would remember the years spent there. The nights when my husband sat beside me reading. The mornings filled with the smell of coffee. But the ache didn't last. It was softened by the knowledge that the room now held a different kind of comfort, one that belonged to children who needed it. I rarely saw my son after that. He came by once to pick up a few things he had left, and our conversation was polite, almost formal. There was no anger in me toward him, but there was no desire to reopen what had been closed. Some doors once shut are better left that way. Spring came slowly, and I tended to the roses in the front yard, showing Sophie how to trim them so they would bloom fuller. She listened intently, her small hands careful with the shears. I told her the roses had been here longer than she had been alive, and if she cared for them, they would keep blooming for many years to come. In teaching her that, I realized I was also speaking to myself. Some things, if tended to quietly and with care, can outlast even the hardest winters. I no longer thought of the house as something I had lost. It was something I had given, and in giving it I had kept my dignity, my choice, and my peace. On warm afternoons I would sit on the porch with a book, the sound of the children playing in the yard drifting to me like music. Sometimes Marlene would join me, and we would sit in easy silence, both knowing we didn't need to fill the air with words to understand what had been built between us. This was my resolution, my ending. Not loud, not dramatic, but exactly as I had wanted. A life lived on my own terms, surrounded by the quiet comfort of knowing I had chosen well. The maple tree in the front yard is budding now, its branches tipped with the faint green promise of spring. I sit on the porch in the late afternoon light, the air cool but gentle, and watch Sophie chase her brother around the yard. Their laughter mingles with the rustle of the branches overhead, and I think about how sound changes a place. For months, the air in this house felt heavy with what was unsaid. Now it feels open, light, as if the walls themselves can breathe again. I have learned that dignity is not something others give you. It is something you keep quietly, even when the world tries to take it. It is the strength to walk your own path, not with noise or anger, but with steady, deliberate steps. There was a time I thought the house itself was my safety. I see now it was never the wood or the bricks. It was the choice it represented, the years of work and care that built it. And that choice, that care, was always mine to give. I do not regret what I did. Not for a moment. In giving the house away, I did not lose it. I placed it in hands that would love it, and in doing so I kept the most important thing, my right to decide my own story. When I go to bed at night now in my small back room, I feel peace settle around me like a blanket. The house hums with life again. My roses are ready to bloom. And I, in my 74th year, have proven to myself that it is never too late to reclaim what is yours, even if it's not in the way the world expects. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments. You never know who might find their own strength in your words.